Imagine a snow-covered mountain pass in the dead of winter, where the frozen stones are slick with ice, and the wind howls through narrow gorges like the screams of the damned. The greatest military mind of the ancient world, a young king who has conquered everything in his path, who has shattered the mightiest empire on earth in open battle, now finds himself trapped. Above him, rocks and arrows rain down from invisible heights. Behind him, his best soldiers lie dead and dying in the snow. For the first time in his legendary career, Alexander the Great is forced to order a retreat. This isn't the story of his greatest triumph. This is the story of his most humiliating defeat and the brilliant, brutal revenge that followed. Welcome to the Persian Gates, where the last heroes of a dying empire made their stand, where Alexander faced his only true defeat, and where the final act of organized Persian resistance would be written in blood on the winter snow. Before we dive into this incredible tale of courage, betrayal, and tactical genius in the frozen mountains of Persia, make sure to smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. We're bringing you the most epic and detailed battles from history, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's journey into the mountains where empires go to die. The year was 331 BC, and Alexander the Great stood at the absolute pinnacle of his power and glory. Just months earlier, on the dusty plains of Gaugamela, he had achieved what many thought impossible. He had faced down the assembled might of the Persian Empire, an army that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and through sheer tactical brilliance had shattered it completely. The great King Darius III, the King of Kings, ruler of the vastest empire the world had ever known, had fled the battlefield in disgrace for the second time, abandoning his throne, his empire, and his dignity to the young Macedonian conqueror. In the wake of that apocalyptic victory, the ancient world had bowed before Alexander. The legendary city of Babylon, the largest and wealthiest metropolis on earth, had thrown open its massive gates and welcomed him not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The populace lined the streets, burning incense and strewing flowers before his feet, hailing him as the legitimate king of Asia. From there, his unstoppable army had marched to Susa, one of the great administrative capitals of the Persian Empire, and captured it without a fight. The Persian treasuries there yielded a fortune beyond imagination, 50,000 talents of gold and silver, enough wealth to fund his entire campaign for decades. Alexander had divided his victorious army into two powerful columns. The veteran general Parmenion, his father's most trusted commander, would lead the main body of troops, the baggage train, and the siege equipment along the famous royal road, the great highway that connected the far-flung provinces of the Persian Empire. This would be the safe route, the easy route, the route designed for massive armies and supply columns. Meanwhile, Alexander himself, ever the glory seeker, ever the risk-taker, would lead his elite units, his most mobile and deadly forces, on a more direct route through the Zagros Mountains. His target was the jewel of the Persian Empire, the ceremonial heart of their civilization, Persepolis, the city of the Persians. The route through the mountains should have been a formality, a victory march through hostile but beaten territory. Alexander's reputation preceded him like a thunderstorm. Cities and tribes were surrendering without a fight, desperate to avoid the fate that had befallen those foolish enough to resist. When the Uxian hill tribes, fierce mountain warriors who controlled key passes, demanded tribute for safe passage, Alexander had responded with characteristic fury. He led a lightning strike through their territory, crushed their defences in a series of brutal skirmishes, and forced their complete submission. It was a textbook example of Macedonian military superiority, swift, decisive, and utterly ruthless. By late January 330 BC, as winter began to grip the high mountain passes with its iron fist, Alexander and his 17,000 crack troops were pushing deeper into the Zagros range. The air was thin and cold, the passes narrow and treacherous, covered in ice and early snow. But Alexander was confident, perhaps too confident. He had faced the massed armies of the greatest empire on earth and had crushed them. What could a few mountain passes possibly hold that would threaten the invincible Macedonian war machine? He was about to receive a very painful, very bloody answer. What Alexander didn't know, what his scouts had failed to discover, was that the Persian Empire was not yet finished. One man, one loyal satrap who refused to accept defeat, was preparing the most perfectly executed ambush in ancient military history. His name was Ariobarzanes, the satrap of Persis, and he was about to teach the great Alexander a lesson in humility, courage, and the terrible price of underestimating a desperate enemy fighting for his homeland. While the rest of the colossal Persian Empire crumbled under the shock of Gaugamela, while its great nobles and satraps either fled in terror or rushed to offer their submission to the new master of Asia, one man stood firm in the face of the approaching storm. His name was Ariobarzanes, and he was no ordinary provincial governor seeking to save his own skin. He was a member of the ancient Persian nobility, a warrior of the old school, steeped in the traditions of honour and loyalty that had forged the empire centuries before. Appointed satrap of Persis by Darius III himself, back in 335 BC, he was the guardian of the empire's very soul. Persis was not just another province on a map, it was the sacred ancestral homeland of the Achaemenid dynasty, the birthplace of the empire's legendary founder Cyrus the Great. It was the hallowed ground where Persian kings had been crowned and buried for over 200 years, home to the magnificent ceremonial capital of Persepolis. To defend Persis was to defend the very idea of Persia itself. For Ariobarzanes, this was not a political calculation. It was a sacred duty. Ariobarzanes was no fool. He had fought on the dusty plains of Gaugamela and had survived the ensuing slaughter. He had witnessed firsthand the terrifying inhuman efficiency of the Macedonian Sarissa phalanx, a monstrous hedgehog of spear points that seemed invulnerable. He had seen the devastating surgical power of Alexander's companion cavalry charges, a hammer blow that shattered even the finest Persian units. He had watched in horror as the greatest army the empire had ever assembled was torn to pieces in a single, catastrophic afternoon. He knew exactly what he was facing, a military revolution led by a commander of almost supernatural genius. He knew the odds were not just long, they were hopeless. But he also understood something on a deeper spiritual level. If Alexander reached Persepolis unopposed, if the ceremonial heart of the empire fell without a single sword being drawn in its defence, then the Persian Empire would cease to exist not just as a political entity, but as a spiritual one. The surrender would be total, the humiliation absolute, and the ancient glory of Persia, which had burned so brightly for so long, would be extinguished forever in a final shameful flicker. But Ariobarzanes was also a pragmatist. His stand was not just a matter of honour, it was a desperate strategic gamble. He knew that Darius, despite his repeated defeats and his humiliating flights from the battlefield, had not yet given up the fight. The great king had fled east into the vast unconquered satrapies of Media, Bactria, and Sogdiana. There, He was desperately trying to gather the tattered remnants of his shattered forces, calling in ancient debts of loyalty and raising new armies from the fierce horsemen of the eastern steppes who had not yet tasted Macedonian steel. What Darius needed more than anything else was a commodity that was rapidly running out. Time. He needed time to rebuild his armies, time to reorganize his command, time to perhaps mount one last desperate defense of the eastern half of his empire. Ariobarzanes, standing on the edge of the Persian heartland with the small force under his command, could give his king that precious, priceless time. Every day he could delay Alexander was another day Darius had to live, to fight, and to hope. The satrap was given precious little to work with. In the chaotic aftermath of Gaugamela, the once mighty Persian military was in complete disarray. The ancient sources, as they often do, provide wildly exaggerated numbers for Ariobarzanes' force, with some claiming as many as 40,000 defenders. However, modern historians, through careful analysis, believe he commanded a tiny fraction of that number, somewhere between 700 and a maximum of 2,000 men. This was a motley collection, a corps of professional Persian infantry who had survived Gaugamela, a local militia drawn from the men of Persis who are now defending their own homes, and a small, almost token contingent of cavalry, perhaps as few as 300 horsemen. Against Alexander's approaching force of 17,000 battle-hardened elite Macedonian veterans, this tiny army should have been little more than a speed bump, a force to be annihilated in a matter of minutes in open battle. But Ariobarzanes possessed assets far more valuable than numbers. He had an intimate, perfect knowledge of the treacherous mountain terrain of his homeland. He had a brilliant tactical mind, honed by years of service to the empire, and he had absolute fanatical determination, the courage of a man with nothing left to lose. He chose his battlefield not for a glorious open confrontation, but for a desperate grinding defense. He chose a place where geography itself could be turned into a weapon, a place where a handful of determined men could indeed hold back an entire army. That place was called the Persian Gates, a narrow, winding mountain pass known in the Persian tongue as Tangi Meyran. It would become the Thermopylae of Persia, the site of one of the most dramatic and heroic defensive stands in all of ancient history. According to later Persian traditions, particularly from the Parthian period, a warrior named Utab, said to be Ariobarzanes' own sister, fought alongside him in this final desperate defence. While modern historians debate whether she was a genuine historical figure or a later legendary addition to the story, the tale of this remarkable woman who took up arms to defend her homeland became a powerful symbol of the desperate, all-hands-on-deck nature of this last stand. In the ancient Persian tradition, unlike in the Greek world, women of the nobility were sometimes trained in the martial arts of archery and horsemanship. Whether historical fact or inspired legend, Utab came to embody the fierce, unyielding spirit of a people who refused to surrender their sacred homeland without one final, glorious and utterly suicidal fight. The Persian Gates was not a single, man-made fortress with crenellated walls and iron gates. It was something far older and far more formidable. It was a natural bottleneck, a narrow, winding mountain pass carved over millennia by the relentless forces of water and wind through the towering snow-capped peaks of the Zagros Mountains. This treacherous route, known as Tangi Meyran, was one of the very few viable paths through this formidable range that led directly south towards Persepolis and Pasargadae, the twin ceremonial and spiritual jewels of the Persian heartland. The pass itself was a nightmare of topography for any invading army. It snaked through steep gorges and shadowed valleys, flanked on both sides by sheer, unscalable cliff faces that rose hundreds of feet into the air. The road at its floor was little more than a goat track in places, narrowing to barely 20 feet wide, a claustrophobic corridor of rock and ice that would force even the most disciplined army to abandon its formations, stringing itself out into a long, dangerously thin and horribly vulnerable column. For a defender with an intimate knowledge of the terrain, it was a tactical paradise. For an attacker marching blindly into it, it was a nightmare made real. Ariobarzanes had spent weeks, perhaps months, studying this ground. He had walked every foot of it, had climbed its treacherous slopes, had felt the biting wind whip through its narrowest passages. He had designed a defensive position that was as close to impregnable as human engineering, combined with the raw power of nature, could make it. At the narrowest point of the entire pass, where the cliffs squeezed the road into a tight, inescapable channel, he ordered his men to construct a substantial stone wall. It stretched from one cliff face to the other, completely and utterly blocking the way forward. This was no crude, hasty pile of rocks. It was a proper defensive fortification, built with the skill of Persian engineers, tall enough to stop a cavalry charge dead in its tracks and thick enough to resist any light battering ram that Alexander's men could possibly haul up the narrow, icy mountain track. It was the perfect plug in the perfect bottleneck. But the wall was merely the bait, the obvious visible part of the trap. The true genius of Ariobarzanes' plan lay on the heights above. On both sides of the pass, concealed on the rocky ledges and outcroppings, hundreds of feet above the road, he positioned the main body of his small force. These men were not visible from the valley floor. They were hidden, ghosts in the rocks, perfectly camouflaged and waiting in silent ambush for the enemy to walk into the killing ground below. For weeks, they had been stockpiling a terrifying arsenal of makeshift gravity-powered ammunition. There were massive piles of rocks of every size, from fist-sized sling stones to heavy boulders that required multiple men to lift and position at the edge of the cliffs. There were thousands of javelins and arrows, ready to be unleashed in devastating volleys. At key points, his men had even prepared massive log piles, ready to be set alight and rolled down onto the attackers below, creating avalanches of fire and splintered wood. Ariobarzanes was not just defending a pass, he was transforming it into a three-dimensional kill zone, a place where an entire army could be systematically dismantled from above, unable to see, unable to reach, and unable to effectively fight back against its tormentors. This perfectly designed defensive position had one final, critical advantage. It was sustainable. The main Persian camp was not located within the pass itself, but was safely positioned at the eastern end, beyond the killing zone, shielded by the mountains. From there, Ariobarzanes had secure access to fresh water, and more importantly to supply lines that ran all the way back to the still loyal Persian heartland. He and his men could be resupplied with food and ammunition indefinitely. This meant he could hold this position not just for days, but for weeks, or even months if necessary. His strategic goal was brutally simple: to hold the pass until the deep winter snows, already beginning to fall, became so thick that all mountain passage became completely impossible. If he could stall Alexander until the spring, the Macedonian invasion would be paralyzed for months, granting King Darius the precious, irreplaceable time he so desperately needed to raise a new army in the east. It was a brilliant, patient, and utterly ruthless plan, executed by a brilliant commander who understood that sometimes the greatest victories are won not by attacking, but by simply, stubbornly, and heroically refusing to yield. In the opening weeks of January 330 BC, as the iron grip of winter tightened its hold on the Zagros Mountains, and heavy snow began to fall in the high passes, Alexander's column approached the Persian Gates. The ancient sources are frustratingly vague on the exact date, but they all agree on the brutal conditions. It was deep winter, a time when the mountain passes became treacherous, ice-slicked corridors of death. Visibility was often severely limited by thick, swirling mist and blowing snow, and the biting, high-altitude cold was a weapon in its own right, capable of killing a man as efficiently as any enemy blade. The Macedonians were confident, their morale still sky-high after a string of easy victories, but they were also weary from their march through the mountains. They had encountered no serious resistance since crushing the Uxians weeks earlier, and Alexander himself, their brilliant commander, had perhaps become too accustomed to the now familiar sight of enemies fleeing at his mere approach. This creeping overconfidence was about to be paid for in blood. The crucial, catastrophic mistake was a complete and utter failure of reconnaissance. Alexander, whether driven by his own supreme confidence, or perhaps by a competitive haste to reach the treasures of Persepolis before Parmenian's slower column, neglected to send adequate scouting forces ahead to properly probe the pass and the treacherous terrain beyond. This was a shocking and completely uncharacteristic lapse in judgment for the usually meticulous Macedonian king, whose victories were often predicated on careful intelligence and preparation. It suggests either a dangerous level of hubris born from his unbroken string of victories, or perhaps his intelligence from local guides was critically flawed, painting a picture of an undefended route. Whatever the reason, arrogance, haste, or bad information, the result was an unmitigated disaster that would cost the lives of hundreds of his best men. As was his custom, and the very source of his legend, Alexander himself led the vanguard of the column, sharing the danger with his men. Behind him, stretching for miles down the narrow mountain track, were his finest and most elite troops. There were the elite battalions of the Macedonian phalanx, the battle-hardened hypaspists, and even units of the elite companion cavalry, now dismounted and leading their horses through the treacherous terrain. They were supported by his specialist light infantry, the Agrianians, expert javelin throwers and mountain fighters from the Balkans, and his famously accurate Cretan archers. These were not green recruits. These were the hardened professional veterans who had marched from Greece to Egypt and to the very heart of Persia. They were the men who had fought and won at Issus and Gaugamela. They were, without question, the finest soldiers in the ancient world, and they marched into the narrow defile of the Persian Gates with the supreme, unshakable confidence of men who'd never been truly beaten. The long, thin column advanced deeper into the narrow pass, the sheer walls of rock rising like silent, ominous sentinels on either side, the winding road ahead disappearing into the depths of the gorge. Making matters worse, the morning sun, rising in the east at the far end of the pass, shone directly into their eyes, the brilliant glare reflecting off the snow and ice, severely limiting their vision. The echoing clatter of 17,000 men on the march, the tramp of boots, the jangle of weapons and armour, the shouts of officers, reverberated off the canyon walls, masking any sound from above. And then suddenly, as the vanguard rounded a sharp bend, they saw it. The wall, a solid, man-made barrier of stone stretching across the entire width of the pass, completely blocking their advance. As the column ground to a halt, a new horror revealed itself. On the heights above the wall, dark figures began to appear, hundreds of them, Persian warriors rising from their perfect concealment among the rocks, like vengeful spirits materializing from the mountain itself. For one brief, heart-stopping moment, there was an unnatural silence, a frozen instant as the Macedonian vanguard stared up in disbelief at the trap they'd just walked into. Then, with a single, guttural roar that echoed through the canyon, Ariobarzanes gave the order to attack. The sky itself seemed to go dark. A massive, coordinated volley of arrows, javelins, and lead sling, stones launched from the hidden positions on both sides of the pass, arcing down with terrifying precision onto the densely packed and completely exposed Macedonian column below. Immediately after, the real killing began. The Persians unleashed their stockpiled rocks. First, a shower of fist-sized missiles that could shatter a skull or break a shield arm, and then massive man-sized boulders that were heaved over the cliffs. These crashed into the Macedonian ranks with the force of heavy catapult shot, crushing multiple men with each horrific impact, their sickening thud followed by the screams of the mangled. The narrow confines of the pass, which should have been an advantage for the disciplined Macedonians, now became a perfectly designed death trap. They couldn't spread out, couldn't maneuver to protect themselves, and crucially, couldn't even see most of their attackers, who rained death with impunity from the invisible heights above. The Macedonian soldiers, veterans of 100 bloody encounters, reacted with instinct born of years of training. They tried desperately to respond. The Cretan archers fired blindly up at the cliffs, but their arrows fell uselessly against the rock faces. The Persian defenders well protected behind natural fortifications and enjoying the immense advantage of high ground. The phalanx, in a desperate act of discipline, tried to lock shields and form a testudo or tortoise to protect themselves from the missiles, pushing forward toward the wall. But moving uphill over icy, corpse-strewn ground in a narrow pass, while under a constant crushing bombardment, was nearly impossible. Men began to fall by the dozens, then by the hundreds. The piercing screams of the wounded and the dying echoed off the canyon walls. The pristine winter snow was rapidly turning into a horrifying red slush. Officers shouted orders that were completely drowned out by the thunderous roar of falling boulders and the agony of their men. Entire platoons were wiped out in a matter of seconds by massive rocks that had been rolled down from the heights, great unstoppable juggernauts that ploughed through the packed ranks, crushing bone, flesh, and armour into the frozen earth. Alexander, at the very head of the vanguard, was in the heart of the killing zone and in mortal danger. The historians tell us that the king himself was nearly killed multiple times, only saved by the selfless actions of his royal bodyguards, who physically threw themselves in front of incoming missiles, sacrificing their own lives for his. For a man who had fearlessly charged into the teeth of the Persian army at Gaugamela, who had personally led cavalry charges against overwhelming odds, this was a completely different and far more psychologically terrifying experience. There was no clear enemy to fight, no glorious charge to lead, no tactical problem to solve with a brilliant maneuver. There was only death, raining down, impersonally from an unseen enemy he couldn't reach, and the horrifying realization that he had led his finest soldiers into a perfect, inescapable trap. That moment was utterly unprecedented in the career of Alexander the Great. It was a violation of his very nature. Since crossing the Hellespont into Asia years earlier, his entire legend had been built on a foundation of unbroken, seemingly divine success. He had won every single engagement, from pitched battles to minor skirmishes. He had solved every tactical problem, had unravelled every strategic knot, had overcome every obstacle, whether it was a fortified city, a treacherous river, or a numerically superior army. He had done it through a combination of dazzling brilliance, lightning speed, and sheer, breathtaking audacity. In his entire military life as king, he'd never ordered a retreat. He had never admitted defeat. He had never, ever ordered his men to withdraw from a fight. But here, trapped in this frozen, echoing killing ground, watching his most elite and loyal soldiers being systematically slaughtered without being able to effectively fight back, he was forced to make the hardest and most humiliating decision of his military life. Swallowing his immense pride, he gave the order that was unthinkable: sound the retreat. Getting out of the pass was nearly as deadly as going in, a chaotic and horrific ordeal in its own right. The narrow road was now choked with the bodies of the dead and the writhing forms of the wounded, creating a gruesome obstacle course for their fleeing comrades. Making matters worse, the rear of the long Macedonian column was still pushing forward into the pass, completely unaware of the disaster that had unfolded at the front. The carefully organised, disciplined military column, the pride of the Macedonian army, dissolved into a maelstrom of chaos and terror. Men in the front tried desperately to turn and flee, crashing into the men behind them who were still trying to advance. Orders were screamed but were lost in the echoing din of battle. It was a scene of utter pandemonium as soldiers clawed and shoved their way back towards the entrance of the pass, desperate to escape the relentless rain of death. The Persian defenders, sensing their enemies' panic from their high perches, intensified their bombardment with savage glee. They began to specifically target the officers with their plumed helmets, the standard bearers with their precious banners, and any man who seemed to be trying to restore order, correctly identifying that decapitating the leadership would turn the retreat into a full-blown rout. And it did. The disciplined withdrawal became a panicked, every-man-for-himself flight that cost even more lives, as men slipped on the blood-slicked icy stones, were trampled to death by their own terrified comrades, or were struck down from behind by the relentless and now triumphant Persian missiles. Time 1.0s. When the battered, bloodied, and utterly humiliated remnants of the Macedonian column finally escaped the mouth of the pass and emerged into the relative safety of the open ground to the west, they hastily established a fortified camp and began to take stock of the disaster. The ancient sources, perhaps out of respect for Alexander, or due to the chaos of the event, do not give us exact casualty figures for this first, disastrous engagement. But they all make it clear that the losses were severe, using terms like considerable and heavy. Based on these accounts, modern historians estimate that Alexander may have lost several hundred of his finest men, with the total number of killed and wounded perhaps as high as 500 to 1,000 casualties. For an elite vanguard force of 17,000, these were catastrophic losses, made all the worse by the fact that these were not ordinary soldiers. They were the very cream of his army, his most trusted and experienced veterans. But even more devastating than the physical casualties was the profound psychological blow. These were men who had come to believe that they were invincible, demigods of war who followed a king who had never been defeated. And they had just been soundly beaten, utterly humiliated, and forced to flee in a panicked rout by what they could now see was a tiny, insignificant Persian force. The myth of their invincibility had been shattered. Alexander's rage was said to be legendary, a terrifying force of nature in itself. Ancient historians record that he was incandescent with fury. He stalked through the hastily erected camp like a caged lion, his expression a mask of black thunder. His anger was a volatile storm, alternating between fits of incandescent rage at the enemy who had dared to defy him, and waves of deep, burning shame and self-recrimination for his own arrogance, for making the amateur mistake of walking blindly into such an obvious and perfectly executed trap. It was a humiliation he had never before experienced. But beneath the volcanic rage was the cold, calculating mind of a genius already working on the problem. He had been outmaneuvered. He had been outthought. He had been beaten at his own game by a Persian commander who had brilliantly turned the unforgiving terrain into an ally more powerful than any army. The emotional outburst was temporary. The cold, methodical desire for a solution and for a terrible, overwhelming revenge was absolute. For the next month, or perhaps 20 agonizing days as the ancient sources differ, Alexander the Great, the supposed master of the world, was trapped. The Persian Gates, which should have been a minor geographical obstacle, now stood like an impenetrable, mocking barrier between him and his ultimate prize. In a frustrating and bloody stalemate, he threw everything in his tactical playbook at the unyielding Persian defence. He ordered several more, direct, brutal assaults on the stone wall at the mouth of the pass, hoping that the sheer, overwhelming force of his veteran phalanx could smash through. Each attempt ended in a costly, bloody failure, with his men being cut down by the relentless storm of missiles from above long before they could even reach the wall. He experimented with nighttime attacks, hoping the darkness would provide some cover for his troops and allow them to advance undetected. But Ariobarzanes and his men were ready. As the Macedonians advanced under the cover of the winter night, the Persians lit a series of massive bonfires on the cliff tops, instantly illuminating the entire killing ground in a stark, flickering light and allowing them to continue their deadly bombardment with perfect accuracy. Alexander even tasked his engineers, the men who had solved the impossible problem of Tyre, with examining the towering heights on either side of the pass, desperately searching for any path, any crack, any crevice that would allow his men to scale the cliffs and get above the Persian positions. They returned with a grim report. The sheer rock faces were too steep, made treacherous and unclimbable by the winter ice, and were in any case well defended by Persian lookouts. Every conventional military solution had failed. Ariobarzanes, the loyal satrap of Persis, had done the impossible. With a force that likely numbered no more than 2,000 men, he had decisively stopped the advance of the greatest military commander of the age. He had forced Alexander the Great, the conqueror of Asia Minor, Phoenicia and Egypt, into his first and only tactical retreat. And now he was holding him completely at bay, bleeding his elite army day after day in a series of futile and costly assaults. The psychological victory was almost as significant as the military one. Every day that passed was another victory for the Persian cause. It was another day for King Darius, now far to the east, to rebuild his shattered armies. It was another day that the carefully crafted myth of Macedonian invincibility, a weapon almost as powerful as the sarissa itself, crumbled a little further. And word of Alexander's shocking predicament began to spread. Messengers on swift horses carried the news throughout the remaining provinces of the empire. Alexander was not a god. He could be stopped. He could be beaten. Other Persian satraps who had been preparing to send messages of submission began to reconsider. The nervous defenders of Persepolis, who had been preparing for the inevitable sack of their city, began to allow themselves a flicker of hope. Perhaps, against all odds, the empire could be saved. Alexander's position, once one of overwhelming strength, was now becoming strategically and logistically critical. He and his 17,000 elite troops were effectively stuck in the high mountains in the dead of winter, their supply lines stretching back through the recently conquered but still hostile territory of the Uxians were vulnerable to raids. The longer he remained pinned down before the Persian Gates, the more precarious his situation became. But the alternative was unthinkable. To retreat now, to admit defeat and take the long, humiliating route around the mountains to rejoin Parmenian's slower column, would be an admission of total failure. It would be a catastrophic blow to his reputation, a signal to the entire empire that he was not invincible, that a determined defense could succeed. Worse, from a strategic perspective, it would grant Darius exactly what he needed: time. A detour could take weeks, even months, in the harsh winter conditions. Such a delay would turn Alexander's lightning-fast campaign of conquest, which relied on speed and momentum, into the one thing he could not afford: a grinding, protracted war of attrition that would allow the Persian Empire to bring its still vast resources to bear against him. He was trapped between a rock and a hard place, a strategically disastrous delay on one side, and a reputation-shattering humiliation on the other. We're just getting to the incredible twist that would change everything. But first, if you're loving this tale of military genius courage and one of history's greatest comebacks, do me a huge favour and hit that like button. It tells YouTube to share this video with more history lovers like you. Now, let's see how Alexander turned disaster into triumph. As Alexander sat in his winter camp, his mind a whirlwind of frustration and furious calculation, working through every possible tactical solution to the seemingly insoluble problem of the Persian Gates, Fortune, that fickle goddess who had so often favoured him in the past, smiled upon him once more. His breakthrough came not from his generals or his engineers, but from the interrogation of prisoners. Among the men his soldiers had captured in the earlier skirmishes with the Uxian tribes, and during the chaotic initial retreat from the pass were local men, shepherds, farmers, and mountain dwellers who knew these unforgiving mountains not as a strategic map, but as their. They knew every peak, every valley, every hidden track, paths they had walked since childhood. The ancient sources, clouded by the mists of time and propaganda, differ on the exact identity and motivation of the man who had changed the course of the battle. Some say it was a simple captured prisoner of war who gave up the secret under threat of torture. Others claim it was a local shepherd, tempted by the promise of an immense royal reward. Still other accounts, perhaps the most plausible, suggest it was a man named Bani, a local tribal leader who made a cold, pragmatic calculation. He saw the tide of history turning, concluded that the final Persian defeat was inevitable, and decided that the best way to save his own people from the Macedonian wrath was to betray Ariobarzanes and curry favour with the new and seemingly inevitable victor. Whoever he was, and whatever his motivation, this guide revealed to Alexander the one secret that could change everything. There was another path. Hidden deep in the mountains, a route so treacherous and so obscure that it was known only to the local shepherds, was a narrow, winding goat track that circumvented the entire Persian position. It was not a road in any sense of the word. It was barely even a trail, a route that no sane military commander would ever consider using for an army. The guide described a nightmare of a journey, climbing steep, snow-covered, almost vertical slopes in the freezing dead of winter, navigating along terrifyingly narrow cliff edges where a single misstep would mean a fatal plunge into the abyss below, and crossing terrain so difficult it would challenge even the most agile mountain goat. But, and this was the critical, electrifying piece of information, this impossible path emerged on the far side of the mountains, directly behind the Persian defences, opening onto the eastern end of the pass where Ariobarzanes had established his main camp. It was the key, the secret passage that could unlock the entire stalemate. The parallel to the most legendary last stand in Greek history was immediate, powerful, and obvious to every educated Greek officer in Alexander's army. 150 years earlier, in 480 BC, the Spartan king Leonidas had held the narrow coastal pass of Thermopylae against the entire overwhelming might of the Persian army under King Xerxes. With just 300 of his Spartan champions and several thousand Greek allies, he had held the pass for 3 days, turning it into a bloody graveyard for the Persian elite. The heroic defence had only ended when a local Greek traitor, a man named Ephialtes, had revealed a hidden mountain path to the Persians, allowing them to outflank the Greek position and attack from the rear. Now, in a stunning and beautiful twist of poetic justice, history was about to repeat itself, but with the roles completely and satisfyingly reversed. This time, the Persians were the heroic defenders of a narrow pass, fighting for their homeland against a seemingly unstoppable invader. And this time it was a local guide who would betray them, revealing a secret path that would allow the Greeks to achieve the victory that had been denied to them a century and a half before. For Alexander, who saw himself as the new Achilles, the leader of a great pan-Hellenic crusade of revenge against Persia, the symbolism must have been intoxicating. Alexander, his frustration and rage now replaced with a cold, predatory focus, leapt at the opportunity. This was the kind of audacious, high-risk, high-reward maneuver that he lived for. It was a challenge that appealed to his heroic self-image, his love of the dramatic, and his supreme confidence in his own abilities and those of his elite troops. He saw in this treacherous mountain path not just a way to win, but a way to win with a stroke of brilliant history-making genius. He immediately began planning a complex multi-pronged assault that would be a masterpiece of timing, coordination, and deception. It would require the absolute discipline of his men, the unwavering reliability of his commanders, and a considerable amount of luck to succeed. But for Alexander, luck was simply another weapon to be wielded. Alexander's plan was a masterpiece of military deception, a complex three-pronged assault that relied on perfect timing and the absolute discipline of his men. He divided his force into 3 distinct groups, each with a critical role to play in the coming symphony of destruction. The first and largest group would remain at the main Macedonian camp, placed under the command of his general Treacherous, one of his most reliable and steadfast commanders. This force, which included the bulk of the heavy infantry and the siege equipment, was tasked with the crucial role of deception. They were to continue making loud, aggressive demonstrations against the western entrance to the Persian Gates, moving troops, banging shields, and shouting war cries, all to create the convincing illusion that Alexander was stubbornly preparing yet another costly frontal assault. Their entire job was to be the focus of Persian attention, to keep Ariobarzanes and his men fixed in their positions, their eyes glued to the western approach, completely oblivious to the real threat that was about to materialize behind them. The second group, a smaller but highly mobile force, was to be commanded by Ptolemy and Perdiccas, 2 of his most trusted and aggressive generals. This force was to move under the cover of darkness and take up a hidden position near the entrance to the pass, concealed from any Persian observation posts on the heights. They were the first wave of the true assault, a coiled spring held in tension, with simple but critical orders: wait for the signal, and upon hearing the prearranged trumpet blast from Alexander's attack, they were to charge into the pass with maximum speed and force, hitting the now confused Persian defenders at the wall from the front at the exact moment they were being assaulted from the rear. The third group, the decisive striking force, would be led by Alexander himself. For this, the most dangerous and critical part of the plan, he hand-picked his most elite, agile and physically resilient troops. He chose his hypaspists, the multi-purpose infantry, who were essentially the special forces of his army, capable of moving with the speed of light infantry, but fighting with the discipline of the phalanx. He selected his Agrianians, the fierce javelin throwers from the Balkan Mountains who were expert mountain fighters, as comfortable on a treacherous cliffside as they were on a flat plain. He also took his personal royal guard, the Agema, and his finest Cretan archers. This elite force numbered perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 men in total. They were ordered to leave behind their heavy armour and carry only their essential weapons and minimal supplies, sacrificing protection for maximum mobility and speed. Every man in this group knew they were about to attempt something that most would consider utterly impossible, a feat of endurance and courage that would test them to their absolute limits. As a cold, moonless night fell over the Zagros Mountains, the plan was set in motion. The campfires in the main Macedonian camp were left burning brightly to give the illusion that the entire army was still encamped and resting for the night. Under this cloak of deception, Alexander led his silent strike force away from the main camp and into the frozen, unforgiving wilderness. The local guide led them onto the secret path, and they began one of the most grueling and legendary marches in all of military history. The ancient sources paint a vivid and terrifying picture of the ordeal. The men climbing near vertical, ice-covered slopes in pitch blackness, their hands and feet numb with cold. The terrifying, heart-stopping navigation of narrow, windswept ledges, where one wrong step meant a silent, fatal fall into the abyss below. The exhausting, soul-crushing struggle through deep snow drifts that came up to their knees or higher, all while maintaining absolute disciplined silence to avoid alerting any unseen Persian scouts who might be patrolling the high ground. The tortuous march took the better part of the night, a brutal test of human endurance against the raw power of nature. Men did fall. The icy paths claimed their victims, who slipped and vanished into the darkness below without a sound. Other soldiers, their bodies pushed beyond their limits, collapsed from sheer exhaustion into the snow and had to be physically helped along by their comrades, who refused to leave a man behind. The cold was a relentless physical enemy, a bone-deep chill that threatened frostbite, hypothermia, and a slow, freezing death. Any lesser army would have broken. But the iron discipline of the Macedonians held. These were men who had followed Alexander from the shores of Greece to the deserts of Egypt and to the heart of Persia. They trusted him with an absolute, almost religious fervour. They believed he was blessed by the gods, a force of nature who could not and would not fail. If their king said they could climb these impossible paths in the dead of winter and achieve a victory that would echo through history, then that's exactly what they would do. Their faith in him was the fire that kept them moving through the freezing darkness. As the first pale light of dawn broke over the snow-capped peaks on January 20th, 330 BC, Alexander's exhausted but triumphant force emerged from the treacherous mountain paths, looking down upon the completely exposed rear of the Persian position. They had done the impossible. They had traversed terrain that no army should have been able to cross in the dead of winter, and now they stood like avenging gods poised to strike at the unsuspecting heart of Ariobarzanes' camp. The delicate and complex timing of the coming assault had to be perfect. Alexander had arranged a simple but effective system of signals, a series of coordinated trumpet blasts that would echo through the mountains, the signal for all three of his separated forces to attack simultaneously. If Treacherous and Philotas attacked too early, before Alexander was in position, the Persians would realize they were not the main threat and could reposition to meet the real one. If Alexander attacked too late, his small, exhausted force might be overwhelmed by the numerically superior Persians before help could arrive. The fate of the entire battle, and perhaps the campaign, rested on the next few moments. Alexander gave his weary men a brief, precious rest, just enough time to catch their breath, drink from their water skins and prepare their weapons for the final, bloody work ahead. Then, as the winter sun rose fully above the eastern peaks, its light glinting off the snow, he gave the signal. A single, clear, trumpet blast was sounded, and then repeated by other trumpeters, the notes echoing sharp and clear through the cold mountain air. The Macedonian trap snapped shut with devastating coordinated precision. With a ferocious, triumphant roar, Alexander and his elite force came screaming down from the heights, crashing into the rear of the Persian camp like an avalanche of steel. The Persians, their attention completely fixed on the western approach where Treacherous's force was making its loud and convincing demonstration, were caught completely and utterly by surprise. Utter chaos and panic erupted through their ranks as they realized, with dawning horror, that they were being attacked from behind from a direction they believed was utterly impossible and impassable. At the exact same moment, miles away at the western end of the pass, the commanders of the other two Macedonian forces heard the distant echoing trumpet blasts. Treacherous immediately launched his main assault, his heavy infantry charging with renewed fury toward the stone wall and up into the pass, their advance now a genuine attack, not a feint. Simultaneously, Ptolemy and Perdiccas unleashed their hidden mobile force, which attacked the pass from yet another angle, adding to the chaos and confusion. The Persian defenders, who just moments before had been masters of their impenetrable fortress, now found themselves caught in a perfect three-pronged pincer movement. They were being attacked from their front, from their rear, and from their flank, all at the same time. Their careful, brilliant defensive position had been instantly transformed into a bloody, inescapable death trap. The very wall that had been their greatest asset, protecting them from frontal assault, now boxed them in, preventing any hope of an organized retreat or maneuver. The battle that followed was as brutal and as desperate as any fought in the ancient world. Ariobarzanes and his men understood immediately that they were doomed. They knew that the battle was lost, that their heroic, month-long defense had been rendered meaningless by a single night's betrayal and a perfectly executed enemy plan. But they did not surrender. They did not drop their weapons and beg for mercy. They did not even try to flee and save their own lives. In what can only be described as a final, glorious, and utterly suicidal charge, Ariobarzanes rallied his surviving warriors for one last defiant assault on the encroaching Macedonian lines. They would die not as trapped animals, but as Persian warriors, on their feet and facing their enemies. The ancient Roman historian Curtius Rufus recorded the incredible, almost unbelievable scene in words that still echo with a profound admiration for the courage of the defeated. The Persians fought a memorable fight. Unarmed as they were, they seized the armed men in their embrace, and dragging them down to the ground, stabbed most of them with their own weapons. These desperate, heroic warriors, many of whom had now thrown down their heavy shields and cumbersome spears to fight more freely, charged with a suicidal fury directly into the disciplined ranks of the Macedonian phalanx. They fought like demons from a forgotten age, grappling hand to hand with the heavily armoured Macedonians, using their own bodies to wrestle them to the ground, seizing their daggers and swords and using them against their owners. They fought with the terrible, liberating fury of men who knew they were already dead, who had nothing left to lose, and who preferred a glorious death in battle to the bitter shame of surrender. According to Persian tradition, Utab, said to be Ariobarzanes' sister, perished in this final, desperate melee, fighting and dying alongside her brother and the last of the bravest warriors of Persis. In their final moments, these defenders were not fighting for victory, which they knew was impossible. They were fighting for something more profound, for honour, for their homeland, for the fading memory of their fallen empire, and to prove to the world and to history that some Persians would never bow before the invader, no matter how powerful he might be. They chose to die as a testament to the unyielding spirit of their people. The exact final fate of Ariobarzanes himself remains one of the great tragic mysteries of ancient history, a story clouded by the chaos of that final desperate battle, and perhaps by the intentional mythologizing that so often follows the fall of heroes. The ancient historical sources are frustratingly contradictory, each telling a slightly different version of his last hours. The historian Arrian, a Roman-era Greek who had access to the now-lost eyewitness accounts of Alexander's own generals, and is therefore generally considered the most reliable source for his campaigns, states simply that in the final, chaotic melee, Ariobarzanes managed to do the impossible one last time. He rallied a small force of his remaining cavalry, perhaps as few as 40 loyal riders, and in a desperate last-ditch charge, managed to cut his way through the Macedonian encirclement and escape the slaughter in the pass. According to this version, this small, battered band of survivors then rode with desperate speed toward Persepolis, their last hope being that they could reach the capital in time to rally its defenders and continue the fight from behind its formidable walls. However, Arrian's account then takes a turn of profound and bitter tragedy. He notes that when Ariobarzanes and his few surviving men finally reached the gates of Persepolis, exhausted and bleeding, they found them barred and closed against him. The garrison commander and the city's leaders, having already received news of the disaster at the Persian Gates, and seeing the unstoppable tide of Alexander's main army now advancing unopposed, had made a pragmatic and cowardly calculation. They had decided that any further resistance was utterly futile and would only result in the city's brutal sack and destruction. In a desperate attempt to save their own lives and property, they chose to surrender. Ariobarzanes, the last loyal defender of the Persian heartland, the man who had defeated Alexander and held him at bay for a month, was betrayed a second time, shut out of the very city he had fought and bled so valiantly to protect. What happened to him after this final, crushing betrayal is lost to the mist of history. Some accounts suggest that he and his remaining men, with nowhere left to run, turned their horses around and fought one final glorious and utterly suicidal battle against the overwhelming odds of the Macedonian vanguard. Other, perhaps more tragic versions suggest he simply vanished into the mountains, a broken man, to die of his wounds in obscurity, or to live out his days as a nameless fugitive in the empire he had tried so desperately to save. While Ariobarzanes' final fate is a mystery, the fate of the rest of his heroic force at the Persian Gates was brutally clear. They were annihilated, The Macedonians, their blood up after a month of humiliating frustration and their devastating initial defeat, were in no mood for mercy. The final battle in the pass was less a battle than an extermination. The ancient sources are unanimous on this point, recording that the Persians were cut down to a man, their heroic, suicidal final charge ending in a predictable, bloody slaughter. With the exception of Ariobarzanes and the tiny cavalry contingent that may have escaped with him, the entire Persian force that had so brilliantly defended the pass for a month was wiped out. Their heroic last stand had ended in their complete and utter destruction, a final, bloody sacrifice for a lost cause. With the heroic defence of the Persian Gates now broken and its last defenders annihilated, the road to the Persian heartland lay open and completely defenceless before Alexander. His victorious and vengeful army, soon reunited with Parmenions' slower-moving column, marched the final, unopposed distance to the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, Persepolis. Known to the Persians as Parsa, this was not just a city, it was a symbol, the sacred and magnificent heart of the Achaemenid dynasty. Its grand palaces and treasuries were built to awe the world, a testament in stone to the immense power and wealth of the King of Kings. The leaders of the city, having betrayed Ariobarzanes and now facing the unstoppable Macedonian host alone, chose submission over annihilation. The great gates of Persepolis were thrown open without a fight, in the desperate, futile hope that this act of unconditional surrender might earn them mercy from the conqueror. What they received instead was one of the most brutal and controversial acts of Alexander's entire career, a decision that is still debated and condemned by historians to this day. Alexander's troops were unleashed upon the civilian population of Persepolis in what can only be described as a horrific orgy of destruction and plunder. The ancient sources paint a grim picture of the events. The Macedonian soldiers, their discipline released and their minds still simmering with frustration from their month-long ordeal at the Persian Gates, were given the city as their prize. Eager for the immense plunder they had been promised for years, and perhaps acting under the tacit approval of Alexander, they swept through the city in a wave of violence. They systematically looted the wealthiest city in the Persian Empire, breaking into homes, temples, and palaces, seizing anything of value. The treasures taken from Persepolis were staggering, a fortune that defies modern comprehension. The historians record that 120,000 talents of gold, silver, and other precious objects were taken from the city's treasuries alone. It was a fortune so immense that it required 3,000 mules and camels just to transport the gold and silver bullion. To put this into perspective, this was more wealth than the entire annual revenue of the Macedonian kingdom for several decades, a sum that would allow Alexander to fund his campaigns for the rest of his life and rewrite the economic balance of the entire ancient world. But the brutal plunder of the city and its people was just the beginning of Persepolis's agony. Alexander and his army remained in the city for 4 months, and in May 330 BC, the final, terrible act of destruction took place. The sources famously disagree on the exact motivation, but the result was the same. Some historians, like Arrian, suggest it was a carefully considered and calculated act of political revenge, a grand symbolic gesture to punish the Persians for Xerxes' burning of Athens 150 years earlier. Others, like Plutarch and Curtius Rufus, tell a more dramatic and perhaps more human story. They describe a great victory banquet, where Alexander and his commanders, in a drunken state, were incited by an Athenian courtesan named Thais to take their revenge for the destruction of her home city. Whatever the true motivation, a sober act of policy, a drunken fit of rage, or some combination of the both, Alexander gave the order to burn the great palace complex of Persepolis to the ground. Torches were handed out, and the magnificent palaces of Darius the Great and his son Xerxes, architectural marvels that had taken generations to build and were filled with priceless, irreplaceable artwork and treasures from across the empire, went up in flames. The fire was said to be so intense that the towering columns of the Apadana glowed red-hot, and the great cedar roofs collapsed in a shower of sparks. The smoke, rising in a thick black column from the platform of the palaces, could be seen for miles across the plains of Persis, a final, undeniable and terrifying funeral pyre for an empire that had ruled the known world for over 2 centuries. The Battle of the Persian Gates represents a uniquely pivotal and revealing moment in Alexander's legendary campaigns. It was a microcosm of his entire career, a single, brutal episode that showcased both his greatest potential weakness and his most formidable, world-conquering strength. His weakness, laid bare for all to see, was a creeping overconfidence that bordered on hubris. Intoxicated by his apocalyptic victory at Gaugamela and a string of subsequent easy surrenders, he had failed to properly scout the hostile winter-bound terrain. He had made the arrogant assumption that his terrifying reputation alone would be enough to clear the path before him. That overconfidence had led directly to his first, and only, clear tactical defeat, a bloody and humiliating retreat from a foe he had utterly underestimated. For a brief, critical moment, that single failure threatened to destroy the aura of invincibility that was one of his most powerful weapons and could have derailed his entire campaign. But the battle also served to demonstrate in the most dramatic way imaginable the very qualities that made him truly great. His response to this unprecedented defeat showcased his greatest strengths, his terrifying adaptability, his absolute, almost pathological refusal to accept failure, his willingness to take enormous calculated risks, and his almost supernatural ability to inspire his men to achieve the seemingly impossible, the grueling high-stakes nighttime march over the frozen mountain paths, the brilliantly complex three-pronged coordinated assault, and the perfect split-second timing of the final attack all serve as a textbook example of the tactical genius that rightfully places Alexander in the pantheon of the greatest military commanders of all time. He did not just win, he turned a catastrophic defeat into one of his most brilliant and innovative victories. For Ariobarzanes and the heroic defenders of the Persian Gates, the battle represents one of the most poignant and inspiring last stands in all of military history. With a tiny, almost token force, vastly outnumbered by the finest army in the world, and defending a cause that was, by any rational measure, already lost, Ariobarzanes had achieved the impossible. For a glorious, defiant month, he had defeated Alexander the Great. He had held back the seemingly unstoppable Macedonian tide, had bought precious, albeit ultimately futile, time for his king and his empire, and had proven to the world that the Persian spirit of resistance was not yet broken. His final, suicidal charge, a conscious and deliberate choice of a glorious death over the shame of surrender, cemented his status as a national hero in Persian memory. He is celebrated in later Persian poetry and literature, from the Shahnameh onwards, as the ultimate embodiment of courage, unwavering loyalty, and patriotic sacrifice, the man who stood when all others fled. The battle also highlighted with brutal clarity a set of timeless military lessons. It underscored the critical life-or-death importance of intelligence, reconnaissance, and intimate local knowledge in any military campaign. Alexander's shocking initial defeat was a direct result of his failure to properly scout the pass and to respect the power of the terrain. His ultimate hard-won victory, by contrast, came directly from his willingness to adapt, to listen, and to utilize the invaluable knowledge of local guides and prisoners. It is a fundamental lesson that has been relearned, often at a terrible cost, countless times throughout military history. No matter how technologically advanced your army, no matter how brilliant your commander, a failure to respect and understand the local terrain and its people can be the difference between a swift victory and a catastrophic, humiliating defeat. The fall of Persepolis and the spectacular, deliberate destruction of its magnificent palaces mark the true symbolic end of the great Achaemenid Persian Empire. While King Darius III would continue his desperate flight eastward, trying to rally new armies from his distant satrapies, his authority was irrevocably broken. His ceremonial capital was a smouldering ruin, his dynastic treasuries were emptied, and his claim to be the legitimate King of Kings now rang hollow. Within a few short months, he would be betrayed and assassinated by his own treacherous nobles, his body left to die ignobly in the dust of a remote Bactrian road, the last ruler of the world's greatest empire dying like a hunted animal. With the death of Darius and the fall of Persepolis, Alexander was now, unquestionably, the king of Asia, the undisputed master of the largest and wealthiest empire the world had ever seen. The lightning campaign that had begun just a few years earlier was reaching its staggering, world-altering conclusion. The Battle of the Persian Gates occupies a unique and fascinating place in the annals of military history. Unlike the grand, sweeping battles of Gaugamela or Issus, which were decisive set-piece victories that destroyed entire armies and fundamentally changed the course of empires in a single afternoon, the Persian Gates was a prolonged, grinding defensive battle that ultimately failed in its primary strategic objective. Ariobarzanes, for all his brilliance and courage, did not save Persepolis. His heroic month-long defense did not give King Darius enough time to mount an effective, empire-saving counter-offensive. He and his men fought and died for what was, in the cold, hard light of history, a losing cause. And yet the battle is remembered, studied, and revered more than 2,000 years later, precisely because it represents something that transcends the simple, brutal calculus of victory or defeat. It stands as an immortal testament to the power of courage, skill, and the indomitable will to resist. More than any other engagement in Alexander's campaign, this battle serves as a powerful demonstration that courage, tactical skill, and the masterful use of terrain can, at times, matter far more than overwhelming numbers or superior resources. With a force that likely numbered fewer than 2,000 men, Ariobarzanes achieved what the hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the Grand Army at Gaugamela could not. He decisively defeated Alexander the Great in open combat. He forced the world's greatest commander into a humiliating, bloody retreat. The fact that this defeat was temporary, that Alexander ultimately won through superior strategy, a stroke of luck, and the effective use of his vast resources, does not in any way diminish Ariobarzanes' incredible achievement. For 30 days, the powerful myth of Macedonian invincibility, a psychological weapon that had paralyzed entire nations with fear, was shattered against the rocks of the Zagros Mountains. And that matters. It proved that Alexander was a man, not a god, and that the will to defend one's homeland could be a force more powerful than any army. The battle also serves as one of history's most compelling reminders that even the greatest commanders are fallible, and that the true measure of their genius is not in their perfection, but in their response to failure. Alexander's failure to properly scout the pass was an inexcusable, arrogant mistake, a lapse in judgment that cost the lives of hundreds of his most elite soldiers. A lesser commander might have been broken by such a defeat, might have blamed his subordinates, or might have stubbornly continued to throw men into the meat grinder in a desperate attempt to salvage his pride. Alexander's response, however, shows the mark of his true genius. It lay not in his inability to make mistakes, but in his almost superhuman ability to acknowledge them, to learn from them, and to adapt his strategy with terrifying speed and flexibility. His willingness to change his entire approach, to listen to the invaluable intelligence from local guides and prisoners, and most importantly, to personally lead his men on an impossible, life-threatening nighttime march, is what ultimately secured his victory. Finally, the Battle of the Persian Gates represents the dramatic and heroic death throes of the ancient Persian world. The great Achaemenid Empire, which had dominated the known world since Cyrus the Great, had first unified the Persian tribes over 2 centuries earlier, an empire that had ruled from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of India, which had survived Greek invasions, Egyptian rebellions, and internal civil wars, had finally and irrevocably met its match in the person of the young king from Macedon. Ariobarzanes' desperate, heroic stand at the Persian Gates was the last significant gasp of organized Achaemenid military resistance. It was the final, glorious act of defiance before the empire that had defined an entire era of human history fell forever. The raw courage of Ariobarzanes, his sister Utab, and their small band of loyal warriors ensured that the mighty Persian Empire, the empire of Cyrus and Darius the Great, went out not with a whimper of surrender, but with a final, defiant and unforgettable roar. The Battle of the Persian Gates stands as one of the most dramatic and emotionally complex engagements of Alexander's legendary campaign. It was his greatest defeat and one of his most brilliant victories, separated by just 30 days and a desperate nighttime march through impossible terrain. It showcased both the danger of overconfidence and the power of adaptability, the limits of military genius and the endless capacity for human courage. Ariobarzanes' decision to stand and fight, even in a hopeless cause, even against impossible odds, represents the timeless choice that defines heroes throughout history. To fight for what you believe in, for your home, for your people, even when victory is impossible and death is certain. His month-long defense, achieved with a handful of men against the greatest army of the age, remains one of the most impressive military achievements in ancient warfare. His final charge, preferring death in battle to surrender, echo the last stands of warriors throughout history who chose honor over survival. Alexander's response to defeat reveals the quality that made him truly great. Lesser commanders might have retreated, might have sought an easier path, might have raged at their subordinates or blamed the terrain. Alexander acknowledged his mistake, adapted his tactics, and led his men on an impossible march to achieve an improbable victory. His willingness to share his soldiers' hardships during that grueling nighttime climb, to personally lead them through the freezing darkness, reinforced the bond between commander and soldiers that was the true source of Macedonian success. The burning of Persepolis remains controversial to this day. Was it revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens a century and a half earlier, a drunken mistake, or a calculated political statement marking the definitive end of the Persian Empire. Whatever the motivation, the sight of those magnificent palaces burning, sending clouds of smoke into the sky visible for miles, marked the end of an era. The ancient world would never be the same. The age of Persia was over. The age of Hellenism, of Greek culture and language spreading across the known world, had begun. The Battle of the Persian Gates reminds us that history is not just about great victories and vast armies. Sometimes the most meaningful moments are last stands, desperate defences by small groups of determined warriors who know they're doomed but fight anyway because some things are worth dying for. Ariobarzanes and his defenders earn their place in history not by winning, but by refusing to surrender, by showing the world that courage and determination could, even if only briefly, hold back the tide of history itself. What do you think about Ariobarzanes' decision to make his last stand? Was he a hero defending his homeland against impossible odds, or was his sacrifice meaningless in the face of Alexander's inevitable conquest? Should Alexander have shown mercy to Persepolis, or was the destruction of the Persian capital a necessary act to cement his conquest? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing your perspectives on these epic moments from history. If you enjoyed this incredible story of courage, defeat, comeback, and the final fall of an ancient empire, make absolutely sure you're subscribed to the channel with notifications turned on. We're bringing you the most detailed, dramatic, and authentic battle histories on YouTube. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, share it with your fellow history enthusiasts, and I'll see you in the next episode where we'll explore another epic clash that changed the course of human civilization. Until then, remember, history isn't just about the victors, it's about the courage of everyone who fought to shape our world.